So first of all, thank you for both of you. We have Dr. Sanam Vakil from Deputy Director of the Middle East and North Africa Program at Chatham House, and we have Dr. Mahmoud Pargu from Australia. He's a research fellow at the Middle East Studies Forum at the Alfred Deakin Institute. Thank you for joining us on this virtual event about the impact of electing the new Iranian president on the foreign policy. First of all, I would like to give you each like 10 minutes to speak on like these 2-3 questions. First of all, I mean, there is like this general kind of idea about the Iranian foreign policy that actually the Iranian president is not like the key one who is actually shaping the foreign policy. It's mostly like the supreme leader. Khamenei is like the one behind the foreign policy. I mean, well, of course, it has some like like power over as an executive position as a president, but there's this common like kind of a understanding of the Iranian foreign policy. I would like to take your views on that. How do you see like Ibrahim Raisi, how much power he would have on shaping the Iranian foreign policy in the next 4 years? And secondly, about let's say, as he's like one of the hardliner, how do you see like the talks will go between the U.S. and the Iran over the nuclear program, especially like as I think Sanam, you have written in one of the articles that for the Biden administration is actually managing the Iran is the most like pressing Middle East issue for Biden administration. So I'd like to, if you can like press on that more, that would be good. And also third one, how do you see let's say the relationship between Iran and Europe, like especially not just over the nuclear program in the next 4 years, also when it comes to like any other issues, especially like as he has like sort of is known by many people as like the Raisi, as he has like a sort of a dark reputation from the past. So how that will like affect the Iranian position when it comes to engaging with the Western world. So Dr. Sanam, please, and then Dr. Mahmoud, you also after that. So each one for 10 minutes, if you can like address this question, and then we can have some follow-up questions.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with Dr. Mahmoud. Happy to share some of my thoughts, although I'm going to defer to Mahmoud because he's just published a book on presidential politics. So he is the real expert on all things presidential, particularly in Iran. The Iranian political system, I think, above all, is important to understand because it's divided and it's a hybrid system divided between an elected Republican system that is based on a European constitution, and that is balanced by a political model that is religious, that has overarching authority placed in the hands of the faqih, Iran's supreme leader. And this balance or imbalance in the political system is often confusing to understand where the power lies. But it's very clear if we had a graph of the system, Iran's supreme leader has appointment and decision-making authority that supersedes all individuals and all institutions in the Islamic Republic. And particularly Ali Khamenei, who has been supreme leader since 1989, benefited from revisions of the Iranian constitution in 1989 that afforded him greater authority and influence in a political system. So this structure ultimately very much inhibits Iran's president from independent decision-making, particularly in the foreign policy decision-making structure. Iran has a consensus decision-making process that is managed by the supreme leader, and foreign policy decisions are prominently made in a body known as the Supreme National Security Council. This body was created in the 1989 and beyond constitutional reform period. And the individuals that sit in the Supreme National Security Council effectively bring together the heads of all of the institutions within the political system, from the Guardian Council to the head of the IRGC and the armed forces, the Speaker of the Parliament, the President, representatives from the Supreme Leader's office, and members of the cabinet appointed by the President. And it's in this body that foreign policy issues are debated and policy recommendations are presented to the Supreme Leader. So ultimately, he has the final say on the strategy as well as the tactical decisions taken by the Islamic Republic. So while there is this edifice of division clearly on critical national security interests, the system comes together and drives a consensus approach on foreign policy. Now, Iran's president does have some degree of influence because, of course, he appoints the foreign minister. This position, of course, requires the approval of the Supreme Leader. So you can again see that there is a supervisory situation that doesn't give the president full autonomy. But because the president also has members of his cabinet represented in the Supreme National Security Council, the executive branch has slightly more presence and slightly more voice. So obviously they can influence the direction of Iran's foreign policy. But it's really important to note that the president doesn't have independent authority or autonomy, but is very much guided through this consensus building process. And ultimately, Ebrahim Raisi is not an individual thus far that has made policy pronouncements or laid out his approach on really many issues, independent of Iran's supreme leader. I see him very much as a mirror image of Khamenei. So much of the foreign policy direction that he has laid out through his campaign, but also just yesterday in his first presidential press conference, really reflects the views of the supreme leader. On the JCPOA, he has pragmatically stated that he supports Iran's return to the JCPOA. And I think that the reason he has done so is twofold. First of all, reducing security-oriented tensions with the international community, I think in the context of domestic challenges, is a huge priority for Raisi's administration. Secondly, Raisi, and this is tied to the first issue, would benefit from sanctions relief and the increase of trade and liquidity in the Iranian economy would enable Raisi to prioritize economic issues because ordinary Iranians have borne the lion's share of economic pressure over the past few years, but also beyond. Secondly, Raisi has been talking about rehabilitating Iran's frayed regional ties, particularly with the Gulf Arab states, and I think this is an important shift that has reflected sort of changes taking place already in the region. Iran and Saudi Arabia are engaged in a bilateral dialogue. Iran and the UAE have engaged in bilateral dialogue. So Raisi will be capitalizing on these shifts. Thirdly, he supports Iran's shift or looking east policy that is also supported by Khamenei, and this will continue to grow after the release of the 25-year cooperation agreement between Iran and China, for example. Lastly, I'll just briefly say that Raisi, hasn't traveled very much outside of Iran. is also sanctioned by the US government. And he has a very skeptical view of the West and Western intentions vis-a-vis Iran. So for that purpose, I think he has no choice but to prioritize regional relationships. He's been to Iraq, and he has stated that he would like to improve and develop Iran's relations with Iraq as well. So this is going to be the parameter of focus for Raisi. And the steps that I think that his administration will take will be to rehabilitate the JCPOA, simultaneously try to improve ties and tensions between Iran and its neighbors, and finally prioritize economic rehabilitation. None of these are easy steps, but if he does pursue this path of the JCPOA, détente, and the economy, it paves the way for his administration to be much more successful compared to the Rouhani administration, which internally in Iran is seen to have really failed to meet its policy promises over the 8 years. So perhaps the bar is very low for Raisi. The expectation is also very low, I think, inside the country for where his administration can go. So it's highly likely that with these low expectations and with this high degree of popular apathy that is, I think, quite unprecedented, we haven't seen such degrees in 2 decades in Iran. Raisi has a very open playing field to demonstrate some degree of progress. The question is he able to? Because he doesn't have huge amounts of administrative experience. But, you know, we'll see. We'll see where he goes. I'm going to leave it there and pass the baton on to Mahmoud.
Yes, please, Dr. Mahmoud.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sanam. Thank you, Ali Agha, and all friends in Kurdistan for arranging this meeting. You know, it's a very important issue, I guess. And these days, everybody asks what's going on in Iran's foreign, what will happen in Iran's foreign policy with Raisi, and what are the powers of the president to set foreign policy. As Sanam comprehensively stated, president does not have a kind of fundamentally important substantive role in foreign policy, setting the policies in international relations. Legally and constitutionally, the supreme leader sets all fundamental policies of the state, including in foreign policy. So, but there is this range of, influence the president can insert through making negotiations, through, consensus making, and all of those, limited amount of, power he has. And as Sanam said, one important venue is Supreme National Interest Council or National Security Council, which I guess 6 members are appointed by president, and another member is appointed appointed by supreme leader, and needs to be negotiated by the president or something. So it means the president, as the head of the council and as somebody who has influence, by 6 members out of 13 members, he's quite influential. But as Sanam said, it's not fundamentally important. It's not about fundamental and important policies, or say fundamental policies of the state, like relationship with the US or other similar things. In these cases, supreme leader is crucial. But the supreme leader also, he knows that he needs to negotiate. He needs to make consensus, because it's the system in Iran doesn't work like North Korea or Syria or for that matter, that supreme leader stands there and just orders and everybody else becomes silent. It needs consensus, because exactly this hybrid political system we have. So, but the amount of changes, but the domain that president can negotiate is limited. So by this, introduction, Raisi, I don't think will change too much of Iran's foreign policy. The rhetoric will change, but general policies will remain the same. But again, Raisi is not like somebody who like Jalili or Ahmadinejad. They have their own kind of independent thinking and philosophies about the world. Raisi is much of a pragmatic politician who cares too much about his domestic image as well, because of the future of the prospect of leadership people are talking about, and the whole image he has tried in the last 2-3 years to shape, that I'm not a very hardliner extremist politician. I'm pragmatic, I'm against corruption, but I'm also concerned, I'm religious. So it's a kind of, so it has its own limitations to go too much about this. Let's go to let me talk about the Iran-US relations. I think again the problem we have here, it's more about a structural distrust between these two countries, and Raisi, or for that matter Rouhani, or even probably other reformists, can do little to change it unless we have really a very fundamental shift of policy from the whole systemic view change. One is that from Iranian side, they have this background of 1953 coup. Then they always refer to the previous experiences of negotiations with the U.S. During Afghanistan, war. They had very, very positive cooperation with the U.S. In Afghanistan. Qasem Soleimani was there. They were helping each other. And then what happened after that? George Bush has, put Iran in the axis of evil. After that, so it was very shocking for Iranians. Other similar thing happened in Iranian nuclear negotiations when Rouhani was doing this. Again, after everything almost was going to be settled down, the US rejected. The third part, probably the more important one, was this, JCPOA. Again, after all this happened, for 2 years of, 2 years or something of negotiations, you reached to a deal, and then Trump came and just tear apart. So this kind of distrust, partly rooted in realities and partly also kind of ideological and conspiracy theory kind of distrust exists in Iran. That Iranians don't trust the US. They always think that the US is trying to is following or pursuing regime change, even when it is involved in negotiations. In the back of their mind, it's regime change. So they are very suspicious. Almost similar kind of suspicion or mistrust goes on in the US. So in the US, you don't have a very clear policy that we want to do this with Iran, we trust. Always there is this mistrust. And that's why this mutual distrust from both sides, it creates the situation that nobody in both parts have kind of clear imagination what we expect from each other. So whenever they engage, it's all because of emergencies and necessities. They are not ready, even after all this, they are not ready to engage in kind of fundamental, negotiations about important issues. So we really lack, kind of imagination about future. How are we imagining the future of Iran-US relations? Apart from solving this nuclear issue, okay, nuclear issue, after that, what then? All about emergency. In Iran, hardliners, exactly because they always think that the US, is pursuing this regime change policy behind the scene. they never are ready to, to start this kind of fundamental negotiations to solve the problem fundamentally. In the US, it's exactly the same. So you have this very, very, and you ask, for example, you ask Iranians or you ask the US, okay, let's say that we reached a kind of agreement about the JCPOA or whatever, new nuclear deal we have. What's next? So what's in the horizon? How do you see? How do you imagine? It's just kind of, we call it inshallah policy. Just to use this Middle East, inshallah, let's see what will happen next. In the US, people for 40 years now, they don't say this, they don't verbalize, but for 40 years they are imagining, okay, let's just pass this, emergency issue, then probably regime somehow some miracle will happen, the regime will change, the people are angry about the regime or something. In Iran, similar kind of miraculous inshallah policy is going on, that is okay, it appears that the shift of power now is toward Asia. Let's see, let's just pass this specific emergency issue, and after that we will come up with some ideas. So it's all about survival or just crisis management, rather than having a very basic say visionary visionary policy toward the future. So how are we going to solve fundamental? Nobody thinks about it. It's just about crisis. And of course there are two more problems. Iran-US problems always intertwined with third-party considerations. I mean, you have all other players outside that they have vested interest here. One is Russia and China. Of course, they will not be happy to see a kind of US friendly Iran. So even for their interest, what's the best interest for them? Just crisis management. We don't want war. Yes, we don't want. We're here. Yeah, it's energy resources, Middle East. But solve it? No, it's not in our interest. And of course, on the other side, you have Israel, you have Saudi Arabia. Also, they have their own considerations. So it's always Iran-US policies have been taken hostage by all these different. And the other thing, domestic politics. So I'll explain later, probably more. I talk too much, I guess. Thank you.
Dr. Mahmoud, actually, just let me start with a follow-up question to you, Dr. Mahmoud, about so basically, since Biden took office, so he's like conditioned to return back to the JCPOA is compliance to compliance, basically. But do you think under Raisi that's going to happen, that Iran will fully be full compliance to the agreement? Or, I mean, and in the Iranian point of view, of course they're going to accuse the U.S. also they're not fully compliant to the deal. So, but I mean, what's going to happen in the next 4 years when it comes to these talks? Do you think there will be any progress, especially seeing America and the concern, and they keep saying that Iran is not too far from the producing the bomb, it's still in the level that. So I mean, is it? Do you think U.S. will make more concessions to Iran just to prevent that happen, or what's going to happen? Sorry, we don't hear you.
You have background noise.
Yeah.
I couldn't hear
really
clearly.
Okay.
So you asked about JCPOA.
Yeah. Let me just repeat the question. Sorry. Can you hear me now?
I hear, but lots of noise.
Is that okay now? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Okay, go on.
Your voice is a bit faint.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Is that okay?
We hear. Yeah.
All right. Sorry. So my question was just to what's your view about in the next 4 years when it comes to this the U.S.-Iran talks? Do you think there will be any progress? I mean, especially like the Biden condition to compliance to compliance. So otherwise, the U.S. will not fully go back to the deal with Iran.
Sanam, can I answer the question?
Please go ahead.
Actually, I expect this same kind of crisis management to continue on both sides. inside Iran, they are not following escalation. It's not in their benefit right now. There is nothing that will, they benefit from escalation, especially with the change of administration in the US. And apparently, the new administration in the US also is not willing to escalate or make kind of, adventurous, moves. And so when both parties are willing to kind of cooperate, I guess this will. So I will not surprise if I see kind of return to JCPOI in any form, and then probably a kind of balance between relations, not normalization, just a normal balance that you de-escalate, lets everything goes in its place. Probably the US will pressure Saudi Arabia about Yemen, Iran does something. These kind of, negotiations and trade-off will be going on behind the scenes. But domestic politics, we are not going to do anything, spectacular that's, comes in news or something. Just behind the scenes, this kind of trade-off, as it has been, usual in Iran-US relations. But I'm not expecting any fundamental change. So it's all crisis. I'm not that huge crisis, but also not fundamental, say, ease of tensions.
Thank you. Sanam, if you can also, I would like to get your views on that question, if you'd like to comment on it.
Absolutely. I share Mahmoud's view. The Iranian system currently doesn't have any interest in escalation. It is urgent and necessary for it to prioritize domestic economic rehabilitation above all. I'm tentatively hopeful that between now and the early fall, a deal will be made on the JCPOA. And as part of this deal, Iran will not receive all of the sanctions relief that it is seeking. And I think it is playing a much more cautious negotiation strategy because of the domestic dynamics in Iran, because it is aware that the parliament will probably lead an inquiry and criticize any kind of concessions on the deal. They will do so because of their views on the deal, but ultimately the deal will be passed. So I do think that this will happen in the next few months. However, that said, there is, of course, an outcome or a scenario where the talks drag on, and they drag on for too long. And if they drag on for too long, the choice or the calculation in Washington and in Europe will be that the JCPOA is no longer worth preserving. Not worth preserving because ultimately parts of the deal begin to expire really quite soon in 2023. So that scenario could result in Iran resorting to its maximum resistance campaign, where nuclear tensions and regional tensions again become part of its leverage building strategy, but all to get back to the negotiating table. I don't see any scenario where Iran can survive without some agreement on its nuclear program with the international community. The question is, will that agreement take place within the next few months or over a longer period of time? One will be a smoother transition for Iran and everyone in the region. The second scenario will probably be a return to patterns of intermittent escalation and tensions like we saw in 2019. And I think that all sides are trying to avoid that scenario.
I'd like to, just for a follow-up question on that, when it comes to the U.S.-Iran tensions in Iraq, so because Raisi, he mentioned in one of his statements that there is no other country that's closer to us than Iraq. So So basically, what do you expect in the next 4 years, especially like this Iranian proxies, militia, sometimes they make attacks on the bases in Iraq to, so a lot of people, they think this is like to press and to gain something out of this talks with the US. And this kind of, do you think, like sort of confrontation on the Iraqi territories between Iran and US in the next 4 years under Raisi, that's expected to be more, and especially maybe through all these Iranian allies in Iraq, as before when they passed a bill earlier last year, like about the expelling the US forces in Iraq. Do you think that under Raisi, that's this kind of a sort of push against the US presence in Iraq and across the Middle East will be more?
Mahmoud, would you like to take this or should I? Go ahead.
Mahmoud
go
also
ahead.
can comment on.
Please.
Go
Sorry,
ahead
I
and then,
didn't hear you, Ali.
yeah, can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
Okay. I'll offer my brief comments. I think the prioritization of regional ties, particularly in Iraq, is hugely important to Raisi, really because I think the thinking among the conservative establishment and the security establishment in Iran is that Iran's regional relationships have been hugely beneficial to Iran through this period of maximum pressure. They've been helpful to provide leverage because of Iran's network of groups that it supports in the region. And the relationships have also been helpful economically, where Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the UAE have all provided a lifeline and access to trade, liquidity that has helped Iran survive through the years. But I do think that Iran has a problem that it is aware of, that its relationship, particularly in Iraq, is predatory, that there is domestic opposition, evidenced through protests and burnings of the Iranian consulate and, criticism of Iran at the street level. And so the question for me is, how is Iran and how is the Quds Force in particular thinking about restructuring some of its relationships so that they are more productive and more less focused solely on the security and military based nature of the relationship, but rather also about nurturing stronger social and political ties. I've heard that there are, of course, debates in Iran as to whether this restructuring or rebalancing is taking place. And under a new Quds Force leader, of course, these changes take time to implement, and then there's opposition to some of these changes. But I think that if Iran seeks to have a long-term productive relationship with Iraq, rebalancing is necessary, and recognizing that there is fundamental opposition to Iran's pressure-based influence in Iraq is important for the future. I'm not sure that the Raisi administration has the capacity to make these bold changes. So again, I have more questions than answers here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mahmoud, actually, if you can speak on like as we know that often like in Iran, it's a military, especially the Al-Quds forces, they like become like also like sort of they have a lot of influence on the, foreign policy in a way, like because like working through all these proxies in the region. First, what's the relationship between Qaani and Raisi? Do you think if they have strong relation, they can, because he's like a replacement of Soleimani, and what's the expectation for the next 4 years, like the strategy of Iran to like expand their influence through these kind of proxies in Iraq, Syria, in Yemen, and in other places, and how that will actually affect Iran's position in the Middle East in the next 4 years?
Actually, we I don't have any kind of information about details of the relationship of Raisi and Bani, or for that matter, other members or other military establishments. As far as we know from public information available, it's very good relationship, supportive for both sides, are supporting each other, and probably if you have seen in Said Hassan Nasrullah's tweets a few days ago, when Raisi was announced here, he tweeted Salamun ala Ibrahim, which is a verse of Quran, and Ibrahim is the name of Raisi. So, and they have published Raisi's images with I think Ani and others, just giving this hint that okay, some pro resistance president now. So let's getting back to Iraq issue, how things are playing out in Iraq. It's again Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, partly Pakistan, and partly also Persian Gulf countries, Arab countries. They are mostly managed by militaries and both force. So even the diplomatic missions, these countries, Lebanon also, all of them, they're controlled by both force. So basically, the main policymakers in these areas are both force. And part of the problem that Sanam also pointed, this issue of I will call it the soft, because it's Quds Force mainly is focused on kind of revolutionary religious discourse in supporting, getting support, and mainly focused on recruiting these say Shiite militias in these countries, building up some hard power capabilities and making leverage against the U.S. assets and allies in the region. But the problem again is that this doesn't look like working in long term. In the long term, you need kind of very rational, social level kind of soft power, which can persuade people that this relationship is for their benefit as well. And it seems that some changes are happening. I'm not sure, because some hints are there. As you have seen, recent negotiations between Iran and Saudi Arabia in Iraq, which I guess was mediated by Prime Minister Kadhimi, probably is one sign that something is going on, and maybe more powers are, being given to Iranian foreign ministry and diplomatic missions rather than just.
Thank you. I mean, so we all know that in the Biden administration strategy, so there is he's always trying to avoid any sort of military confrontation with Iran. But it seems like Israel, as we also hear in the press, their statement about the new leader of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi. So the Israel is maybe is more angry than, well, I mean, they're always angry against Iran, but it seems like because to have Raisi as a president is sort of provocative for Israel. So do you see any likely scenario for any armed confrontation with Israel? I mean, either directly or it would happen sometimes as we see the Israeli airstrikes in Syria, but is that possible any clashes in the next 4 years that will and the Raisi the relation there will be any confrontation with Israel? Sanam, if you like to, or Mahmoud, if you first want to comment on that, please.
Shall I go ahead?
Please go.
Okay. Ali, you asked about Israel and Iran and the likelihood of tensions. Yeah, the problem in these, political international relations, anything relevant to humans, is that it's really difficult to do any kind of prediction with a reasonable, say, accuracy. But what it looks like, first of all, Israel, it's unlikely that will act independently of the US, any kind of serious, military engagement with Iran directly. So it's unlikely. First of all, because of the problems it can cause for themselves, without US supporting them militarily, nobody knows what will happen because of Iran's leverage and militias in the region. All over Israel is under kind of Iranian supported militia missiles, and it can easily, scale up. It's not something, I guess, in Israel anybody wants it. And so, on the other hand, it looks like the new administration in the US is not willing to engage in any kind of broad, all-out military war. So, I will say it's very unlikely that there will be some all-out, military engagement. I assume Israelis will continue their, targeted attacks on Iranian assets in Syria, in other countries. They'll continue doing this sabotage in Iranian nuclear missile, stations, bases inside Iran. Probably cyber, activities and war and all these kind of efforts to kind of cripple Iranian nuclear program. But other than that, I'm not expecting any kind of. We don't know, but I'm not expecting. It's not reasonable at the moment to engage in this kind of independent.
Sanam, what do you think? Do you think is there any likely
just
scenario?
Just to add to Mahmoud's excellent analysis, I would say that the change in government in Israel, of course, is seen to be positive for Iran. Netanyahu was in power for well over a decade, and his departure is probably seen in Tehran as I wouldn't call it a victory, but an opportunity where the new Israeli government, which remains quite critical and concerned about Iran's regional activities, particularly on Israel's border. So, tactically, the policies won't change. The strategy remains the same, but having a new government at the helm that won't instrumentalize or publicly celebrate the gray zone attacks that have taken place inside Iran or around the region could be an important shift for Iran, be less embarrassing, definitely, but could also open the door for some back channel red line establishments, perhaps through the Russians in Syria, that would be important for Iran to also lower the pulse of tensions there. So, that is something that we could see take place. But if the JCPOA drags on for too long and Iran begins to further accelerate its nuclear program, there could be, an uptick of independent Israeli activity against Iran at the same time. So, these are just scenarios that we have to consider that all very much hinge on the Vienna process.
So when it comes to, you both mentioned that Iran, especially the hardliners, are very skeptical about the West. Including the RRC, and if this kind of talks with the Western countries, especially with the US, if that and the RRC also had failed and didn't work. So, but of course that Iran financially not in a good shape, so they need to find a way to survive. They're still in a surviving position, not in a progressing position financially. Do you think that Russia and China, especially this Chinese deal, 25 years deal with Iran, and Russian economic ties with Iran, and even when it comes to military ties with Iran, do you think that these two powers, they can save Iran from this internal crisis they have, or the other crises they face in the region. Mahmoud, please go ahead. Okay.
I have to apologize, Ali. I didn't hear everything, but I heard Russia and China. The connection is not very good.
Okay, let me repeat it then. Can you hear me now? Well?
A bit better.
All right.
Tiny bit better.
So the question was on so Iran is it's facing all this financial and other internal crisis. And do you think China and Russia can really save Iran from this? I mean, because they're in a surviving position, not in a progressing position, to help Iran militarily and financially to stand on its feet and to face other issues like in the Middle East. I mean, because it's likely, again, that maybe these talks with the U.S. or Western countries will fail. Maybe it doesn't work, and then maybe, so there won't be any much kind of a gains for Iran from this kind of a talks when it comes to financial and military achievements.
Thank you.
So,
well, I think actually nobody can save Iran but Iran. So looking to China and Russia to maybe band-aid and provide assistance, that's certainly possible. But I don't think that neither China nor Russia see Iran as a huge priority. They see Iran more as an opportunity, economic and strategic. And, you know, clearly Iran and members of the Iranian political establishment also see these relationships as beneficial. But I'm sure they are mindful of the fact that Iran is a second order priority in the context of geopolitical competition and regional competition. And that must foster a certain sense of insecurity. That said, you know, it's important to look at the dynamics between Iran and Russia and Iran and China separately. I think that both countries have an interest in seeing the JCPOA rehabilitated, because that will embolden and sort of support their growing relationship. But the relationship has been an enduring feature between the three countries for a number of decades now. Russia offers Iran hedging, and there's cooperation in certain areas, but there are also differences in certain areas. And what's particularly interesting is that both countries are quite skillful at managing their differences and recognizing the areas of cooperation and the limits of their relationship. The Chinese relationship has its own dynamics and its own features. China cannot and will not prioritize Iran over other regional states. China's strategy in the Middle East, which is also not a priority. China's first area of focus economically and politically is its near abroad. The Middle East has a longer sort of strategic connection for China. But if you look at the way China manages its relationships around the region, it has a diversified portfolio of relations with the highest level of relationships, the comprehensive strategic partnership, which is economically and politically driven, with 5 very different countries: Egypt, Algeria, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. So that in itself will tell you the prioritization, both strategic and economic, of China in the Middle East, despite pressure from the Gulf Arab countries through the maximum pressure campaign. China refused to pick sides between Iran and the GCC states. And furthermore, you know, China did provide Iran with some small scale trade, did continue to buy Iranian oil through third parties through the sanction period, and of course has increased such purchases more recently. But China didn't swoop in and provide an economic lifeline in a way that many people hoped. I think that Iran sees itself as strategically important to China because of its geographic proximity to Central Asia. And so it can be a connector between China and the Middle East. And this is what I think is very much behind the broader partnership and the strategic cooperation that was revealed last year. What is also appealing about China for Iran, but also for other Middle Eastern states, is that China has a very clear policy of non-intervention in domestic affairs. And so that is attractive compared to Western patterns of interference or pressure on human rights issues and the like. So, you know, in sum and in short, both of these relationships provide Iran with the ability to hedge, to balance, and to maintain a lifeline to important, you know, geopolitical competitors of the United States. But neither of these countries, I think, see Iran's regional activities and its destabilizing capacity as positive. So there are challenges there that Iran, you know, strategically thinks about, but we don't see any sort of shift within Iran about moving away from its resistance views of the world and its strategy on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanam. So Mahmoud, if you have any comments on the same questions, like on, and because we actually almost running out of time, so maybe if you can also have some.
No, I think Sanam's explanation was quite comprehensive and excellent, and that's it. I don't think I can add more. But just this problem with China, you know, they say Iran as an opportunity in Chinese, you know, view of the world. It's important to understand it, and it used to be there from the 1980s when Chinese were selling to Iran this Silk Road missiles during Iran-Iraq war. Then later on, they have always been looking to Iran as kind of opportunity to leverage against the US. And it looks like it's still there. It's very important. But it's whatever Iranians are doing and how much they are investing in this relationship, it can simply go out with one slip. If Chinese decide, okay, this is important now, we just sacrifice it for the relations with the US or other important thing. But also Iranian, you know, oil is important for the future because Chinese are 40% or 60%, something like the imports comes from Middle East. And Iran is, because it's not a client state of the US, so it's an independent oil supplier is important. And also Iran is important in the sense that for China probably would prefer an Iran or a Middle East which becomes a gangmire or a distraction of US. You know, so the more US is kind of, you know, distracted to Iran and other, you know, problem makers, it's much better for China, so that China is not becoming, you know, a salient central problem for the US. But if you have emergent, you know, very urgent issues like Iran, you have urgent issues, and then it's better. It takes the energy and the focus. So it's also there. So any kind of, you know, permanent, improvement of relations with the West, solution of with the West is not in China's interest. I guess not in Russia, not in China. It's just kind of, as I said, crisis management is you know, is in the interest of everybody: China, Russia, Iran, and the US. Of governments, of course, not people.
Okay. Thank you very much for both of you. For Dr. Sanam Vakil from Chatham House and Dr. Mahmoud Pargu from Alfred Deakin Institute from Australia. As Rudaw Research Center, we were very grateful and thank you a lot for your contribution today with us in the virtual event, and looking forward to have you in the future events with Rudaw Research Center. I wish you both have a good day, and thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.